Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 131 of Circle of Fellows. This is the monthly panel discussion featuring usually four fellows of the International Association of Business Communicators, talking about topics of interest to communicators, especially those pursuing certification or looking to further themselves along their career paths. And we have a topic that should resonate with a lot of communicators today, especially those engaged in media relations, and that is the shifting landscape of media and media relations, and have four great panelists to discuss this. Before we get to their introductions, I'll let you know who I am. Hi, I'm Shel Holtz. I am Senior Director of Communications at Webcor, a commercial general contractor headquartered in San Francisco and operating throughout California. I'm also the Vice Chair of the Global Communications Certification Council, which explains that SCMP that you see after my name. And if you are watching live, I hope that you will participate in the conversation. The best way to do that through YouTube is just to use that live commenting feature. I'll see it here and I will be able to share that on the screen. And always nice to be able to digress to answer a question from somebody who's watching in real time. And with that, let's meet the panel, starting with Diana. Hi.
Hi, Shel. Thanks for having me today. Thrilled to be here with my illustrious group of other people, other fellows. So I am an IABC Fellow. I am a IABC Canada Master Communicator. I'm based in Guelph, Ontario, which is about an hour west of Toronto. I am the founder of Diana Deegan and Associates, and I am also a professor at Conestoga College teaching a number of different communications and public relations and marketing courses.
Great. And a special welcome to you, Diana. You are a member of the 2026 class of Fellows.
I am. Thank you very much. So exciting. So exciting.
Martha, you're up.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. I'm actually in the far east of Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador. I run my own consultancy in strategic communications and policy research. And I also teach communications and writing skills with the local business center at the University, Memorial University of Newfoundland.
Thanks, Martha. Ned.
Good day, everybody. I'm Ned Lundquist. I'm an accredited business communicator and an IABC Fellow. I'm a retired naval officer, and my wife likes to tell me that I'm retired, period, at this point. I still have a few clients. I still do some writing. Just attended a conference on maritime security and safety in, of all places, St. John's. And Martha and her husband, John, scooped me up, and I got a whirlwind tour of the far eastern segment of Atlantic Canada. It was fascinating. So Shel and I and Jennifer go way back. Diana is a new colleague that I haven't connected with, but as a fellow, I'm sure we will going forward. So Shel, thanks for doing this, and thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, Ned. And Jennifer.
Hi, I'm in North Vancouver, Canada, and pleased to be here today on a warm summer day. I'm also an SCMP and proud of that certification, and really happy to have some listeners here who are pursuing certification. I specialize in strategic storytelling as a consultant, and like many of you, also teach at the Sauder School of Business communications to business school students. I love that intersection of business and communications, which is of course something we've all been working toward and uplifting for a long time. Looking forward to today's discussion.
It'll be a great discussion, Jennifer. Thanks. And in my early days doing media relations, whether it was for an employer or after I moved into consulting for a client, it was pretty routine to hear somebody say, I want the front page of the Wall Street Journal, or I want to be here, or I want to be there. And that was the remit, right? That was what you set out to do, at least to get them good coverage that could show them that they moved the needle. And you had built relationships with reporters at the various mainstream media publications and trade publications and the like. And you knew how to pitch, you knew how to do a targeted press release distribution, and you got that coverage. Not so easy today with these media outlets constricting considerably and many of them vanishing. Although it was interesting, I just read that I think it's the New York Times is opening a local newspaper in Minneapolis. So we may see a new model emerging here.
Wow.
Revenue that they can derive from that. But for now, it's a challenge to earn that earned media coverage is critical if we're going to show up in AI search results, the overviews and the research results and the like, because I've seen data that says 85% of what the AEO and GEO engines are producing come from earned media, only about 12 or 13% from a brand website. So we have challenges in front of us. So let me start by asking you, what's changed most fundamentally when we say that media relations has changed? Which change matters most? Is it the loss of journalists? Is it the collapse of newsroom business models? The fragmentation of audiences? Something else? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I'll jump in. My feeling is that we've lost a whole segment of, I'll call it local media, small town papers, small town dailies and weeklies, supplements with local news in the large papers. So I'm not exactly sure where people go for that news. I know there are online sites that provide local news, but I just think we've lost a whole tier of connectivity to connect citizens with government, with business, with things to do. I don't think that people are going to the web to these new sites. They're just browsing and finding what they can anywhere, kind of hit or miss.
I agree, Ned. It's been a huge loss to see the decrease in the small town papers, because one of the best things I found with my media relations work was connecting those editors with local people on the issues that I was trying to promote, and being able to provide local content, local contacts, and that local context was really critical to the success, because you don't want to always just coming from head office or the principal city, because sometimes there are resentments that all the news gets funneled one way. And it also meant that people could see in different areas how the story could play out depending on that regional context.
Yeah, I would agree on the community news reporting element of things. We had a tragic event here just in my community, which is not a small town, this week. And what I noticed was that in the absence of hyperlocal reporting, so in other words, metro-wide reporting was existing, that nuances around the community that I live in went missing. So, the name of the shopping center where the tragedy happened, even the way that streets were referenced and businesses were referenced, those kinds of things became slight inaccuracies that added up to a broader sense of, if you're in that community, kind of go, okay, well, this doesn't pass the sniff test, right through to, important things like traffic reports and those kinds of things. I'm sure as in many markets, we had the news a couple of weeks ago of several local radio stations shutting down that are all serving local markets. And so that amalgamation and consolidation continues to really shape the way our communities and the way our communities show up and the way we show up with each other.
I was going to bring up that point, Jennifer, and it was 5 Rogers stations across Canada were shut down, and one of them was the Kitchener station, which is right next door to where I live, and has a huge impact on this entire area because it was a major radio station, and the outcry locally was huge. So many of the community members were so upset that this station had closed down because it had been around for a very long time and had a very long history in the area, and everybody was outraged. And this goes to how the business model has changed for so many of these for the media, and how that corporately is changing journalism, right? And that the reason it was so coincidental that this happened the day after Rogers announced that they were buying back a lot of the stock and taking over the Rogers Entertainment and Sports franchises. And so, well, look at that. They do this one day, and the next day, all of these stations are being closed. And you can't look at that and go, this is not an isolated situation. These are tied together. And so there was a lot of outcry going on because of the effect that it has on the daily lives of a lot of these people, because of the communication, because of what is the role that these networks, that the papers, that the radio stations all play for the communities that they're in. My community, Guelph, does not have a printed daily paper anymore, and we're not a small community. What has cropped up in the meantime are 2 online newspapers. What is interesting is that this week, because I've got my eyes open because we were talking about doing this podcast today, Village Media, which is based out of Northern Ontario, announced that they're launching 15 local newspapers in the United States, along with the Knight Foundation. So they're taking this model of being online, and they're now taking it into the United States because it has done so well here in Ontario. So that was really interesting because it is a not-for-profit organization, a charitable organization that is providing the funding, and they're going into, I think it's 3 states, Wisconsin being one of them in the US, because they're recognizing that a lot of these smaller communities don't have anything anymore. The media are being pulled from these communities. So there's a lot of changes that are happening that are robbing the communities of the information that they have traditionally had.
I'd like to just add to that when we're talking about radio stations, and I think it's true for TV and print, but particularly with radio, there are companies that are buying up. There's no restriction for how many media outlets you can own anymore in the United States. So we have companies that are just buying up all the licenses, and they may be converting them all to the same format, such as the K-Love format, which is now virtually in every market. And this has really had an impact on local journalism and local programming for radio, TV, and print.
Yeah. When the funding for public radio, public media was cut by Congress in the U.S., it didn't put an end to NPR and PBS. What it did was it shut down small local stations, and a lot of those were in news deserts. It was the only access to local news that people had. And we have a comment from Brian Kilgore, and he makes the point that when you look at what space is available in the publications, a lot of it's being filled with what he says is repetitive politics. I subscribe to our local newspaper, the East Bay Times, here in the San Francisco East Bay. And as I flip through it, it's AP and it's Reuters and it's other wire copy. It's from their affiliate partners with the New York Times and the Washington Post, which means that we're not learning about what happened at the zoning commission. We're not learning what happened at the school board. And I think that stuff is important. I don't know how important it is from a media relations or a corporate communications standpoint, but I think from a democracy standpoint, it's absolutely critical. I'll tell you what I'm doing is I have set up a skill in Claude, the AI large language model, that scours all of the local government websites for both upcoming meetings and what they're going to be talking about in the minutes of past meetings. And it builds me a little newspaper that I can read every day. It also covers things like where there's going to be street closures around me. It does a little police blotter. I keep tweaking it. One of these days, I'm just going to set it up so it automatically publishes to the web, not just to my Claude implementation where I can see it, so that there is a local newspaper here that does cover that stuff, just, because I can. But with this introduction of, we've now heard of two, Diana, what you mentioned and what I heard about the New York Times doing, it sounds like there's a bit of a resurgence underway. Are there parts of the media ecosystem that are still healthy or at least healthier than people assume?
Shel, just to build on what you're talking about, I do think this perhaps responsive rise in citizen journalism is probably the wrong terminology in this particular case, but what you're describing, I mean, like many of you, I've switched to following a lot of independent journalists. And while that's in response to shifts in the media landscape to do with what you were talking about, Ned, that kind of broader ownership issue and the influences and independent thought, et cetera, I like the varied and diverse tone that brings to my understanding of issues in a way that is perhaps more insightful than I might have had previously. Now, is that sustainable? I have no idea, honestly, how some of these, in some cases, very well respected, the high profile individuals are funding their independent ventures. But I do think it's not an unhealthy shift in terms of, again, that diversity of presentation of thought.
Shel, I just want to add something to what Brian said. Thanks for listening, Brian. I know you're our best patron. A news hole abhors a vacuum, and so they're going to fill it with something. That's why I've always said, give them something, because sometimes they just need to plug a hole. But we're all right. There's no longer the local budget going around for covering things like the school board and the city council and those types of things. And that was a mission for local journalism for decades.
Yes,
indeed. And I'm going to say, and that was always the reason for local media, right? Like they were always the reason why we had the local reporters and the local papers, was to make sure that they were there to cover off what was happening locally for politics, locally for what was going on in your city, so that you knew what was happening. My 85-year-old mother constantly talks about the fact that she is not computer literate. And quite frankly, I don't want her on a computer because she has been the victim of fraud several times now. And I just know if she was on the computer, it would be so much worse. But she's constantly saying, I don't have access to the news. I don't know what is going on. So she's getting it through me, because there is no other way for her to get any information, because we don't have a local newspaper anymore. And because of that, she's not getting the information that is coming out about what's going on in our city. And there are a lot of other vulnerable people in our society who are not getting the information because they don't have access to getting anything online, because they don't have internet or what have you. And, and that is a sign of democracy within a community and within our countries. And if you don't have that, how are you getting that information, right, about what is going on in your city? And nowadays, it is so important to be making sure that you are getting true information, truthful information, and not misinformation. And when you're not getting that provided, how are you ensuring that what you were getting is proper information? Now, the other side of that as well is that when I've been doing media relations over the last couple of years, one of the big changes that I have found is that publications that were always you were able to talk to get information to work with your clients, now all of a sudden are wanting money. You know, they are wanting advertising. You can only get a story if you are going to be buying advertising. And that has been the other change that I have found, that shocking in some ways, because that was not what was happening prior. And so that has been another business model shift that I have found that has happened.
And Diana, you're 100% right about that, because and when you have a publication that goes to pay to play, I personally view it as just a big publication of press releases, and I think a lot of other people do. So I think journalism still has a place for professional journals.
And it was not even, and it's not because that's not what they look like. If you're reading it as a consumer, you would not know. I mean, there's certain publications you look at and you go, okay, they've paid for that spot. These are not publications that when you look at, and traditionally they were never that way. And when you're looking at these publications, you're not looking at it going, oh, they've paid for that placement, right? And it's so disheartening to see that is now what is happening. And interesting enough as well, I was scrolling through my Instagram on the weekend and came across, she would be a beauty editor. And she had put a post up about how often now she is running into PR people from product companies saying, where's my coverage? I sent you product. Where's the coverage for the product I sent you? And she's going, hey, wait a second here. You don't automatically get coverage because you sent me product. That's not the way it works. But this is a change with these expectations now because of social media. So it's interesting how social media and influencers and have changed this dialogue as well. I thought that was a really interesting comment to come from an editor at a beauty magazine as well, with these expectations.
I would say to him, you got to give me more than just product. You got to give me a real story with, has news value.
Well, and it was interesting because she actually said, you don't just get by sending me product. There actually has to be a reason. There has to be, I actually have to try it. I actually have to like it. You don't just get like it was. And I actually responded to her and said, yeah, there has just been this change. And these like, and it's one of these things like, okay, I remember that. Like, I feel like, my grandmother now, like, I remember the days of, when we walked in snow and I was 15 feet high, it's like, I'm now of that era. Right. But because just the way the expectations have changed because of social media and influencers, and you give me something, I'm going to say something, right? And it's going to be nice, right?
Well, there's also the expectation that you're going to pay for play, not in a more traditional context. I'll give you an example. About a week ago, I got a call from a production company. They're under contract to CBS News. So, I mean, CBS News is embroiled in its own stuff right now, but it's still one of the major news outlets among the broadcasters. And they're doing 35 segments around the America 250 theme, and each segment's about 4 minutes. And they want to do one on construction. They want to come out and highlight our company. I'm on the phone 20, 25 minutes with this guy talking about, what we could talk about and what we're doing in sustainability and things like this that would be of interest to an audience. And the producer is getting very excited, and we're starting to make arrangements. And then this is a classic example of bearing the lead. He says, by the way, there is a $60,000 buy-in Yeah. So I thought you were under contract to CBS. Well, yes, they're under contract to produce the items, but they have to raise the money to handle the costs of production on their own. So you're seeing more and more pay to play like this in order to play in traditional mainstream and trade media.
I've been approached by 2 different publications since I've become a fellow for, the story. And and it's like, I'm now asking the question of, and is there a cost to be involved? Because we'd like to feature you, right?
Got to start with that.
Well, exactly, right? I clicked in pretty quickly. And it's like, lovely opportunity. What's the cost? Right. Which is unfortunate.
I think a really big question here is we need a broader conversation about ethics when it comes to media coverage, when it comes to communicators. Our association, we have a code of ethics. There are a number of news agencies. CBC, for example, has the JSP, which is Standards and Principles of Journalism. And a number of news organizations and practicing journalists, for example, have been working with mental health agencies on how they can cover appropriately news stories in which individuals have died by suicide and what can be done. And often now you see at the end of these stories a link to mental health resources. So there's a conversation happening around how we can approach conversations ethically. And the other side for me about the changes we've seen in media ownership and how stuff is covered, the flip side of shrinking organizations means that you have a loss of triangulation. So as a social policy researcher, I try to collect information in different ways. What are the studies that have been done? Can we do a survey? How about testing some of those results in a focus group? What about consulting and holding public meetings with key informants so that you can test what you find? And the loss of multiple media services means that ourselves as consumers of media, we don't have the ability anymore to test what we learn against other sources. And when you have media influencers, when you have, and I'm not talking about the journalists who are doing really interesting work on their own and publishing that through Substack or other means, but when you have people who say, oh, I'm going to whip out a phone and cover this and tell you the real truth to provide the hot take on issues that's not necessarily grounded in knowledge or evidence-based information and research, we have a deficit of critical thinking and analyzing because we also lack all those sources in which to assess. And so in my work with media relations is I try to connect people with different kinds of sources. So at least within a piece that results, there can be multiple sources of information about the issues from reliable, trustworthy contacts. And I think that's part of the bigger conversation when we encounter pay to play, because then we're only getting single source information.
I'd like to add something to what you said, Martha. I'm so glad you brought up the IABC Code of Ethics because it really does underpin everything we do. And that is when we're dealing with the media, whether we're an editor dealing with one of our journalists or a source, or we're journalists dealing with sources or readers, it all comes down to trust, and trust has to be truth-based. When we are writing, we're reporting, we're consuming information and sharing it, it all has to be based on the truth. And that's where a lot of media have gotten away from fact checking, gotten away from ensuring sources are legitimate. But as a communicator, dealing with our bosses and dealing with our consumers, readers, writers, viewers, listeners, it's got to be truth-based, and we got to build trust with our constituents, and you have to keep earning it all the time. If you lose it, it's something that's extremely hard to restore.
Right. And when we put that, our own professional communications code of ethics, when we use that as our filter, as our compass, et cetera, in these discussions about the media landscape and the value of ethical communications and journalism as it relates to that, really that can help guide us in a kind of a more meaningful way than even some of the tactical examples some of us are discussing, right? So pay to play, for example, I think our code of ethics gives us some guidance about that. And that will be, each of us need to figure out how to apply that within our organizations, whether they be educational, corporate, not-for-profit, et cetera. So yeah, I think we have that guidance within us. And Martha, as you say, and I'm sure all of us speak to students about this, I say, like, whatever community you find, whatever path you choose, there will be a code of ethics. So it's not just ours. It's the journalistic code of ethics. It's all of those things that keep us true to the truth.
Yeah, Jennifer, you and Martha both raised something I want to talk about for a minute, and then we have a comment from a listener. But you both talked about what journalists are doing if they don't want to be associated or affiliated with a mainstream publication anymore, or if they have been let go. A lot of them are starting their own media companies, or they're just starting to crank out a Substack. They're continuing to employ the practices and principles of effective journalism. They're just doing it through a different channel. And I haven't checked, but I don't think that Cision and the other PR services companies that are configured to help you reach journalists are making this transition and identifying all of those newsletters on Substack and Ghost and all of the other platforms that are available for this, all of the YouTube channels that are being set up as media outlets for some of these journalists creating their own media outlets. And it seems to me that it would be a lot of work to identify those. Where I work, we are trying to shift the perception in the marketplace of the kind of markets where we are active, because that has pivoted. So that wasn't that difficult, 10, 15 years ago. It's a nightmare now. How do you find those? And how effective is it if you pitch one journalist with their Substack newsletter as opposed to the journalist who's in the publication that's being read by far more people?
And that is why we do a lot of work. That's the relationship building part of what we do, right? And that's what we do. That is what media relations, that's our job. If we're doing it well, is to stay connected and to find out who is doing what and where people are, and to build those relationships and to understand the areas that we are working in and who is doing what in any given, at any given time. It has always been part of our job to understand who is where, because they were always moving around, always changing, and they were. People within the media were moving from beat to beat to beat within, newspaper or TV or whatever at any given time. And it has just become, more complex and more compounded and more fragmented than ever before. But as you are doing, building those relationships, and that is what we have to do today. We have to maintain those relationships, and we have to stay on top of that. And we have to understand who is where, so that we can be the type of person who makes the journalist job easier, so that we can have those relationships, foster those relationships, so that we can do our jobs.
And one of the things I used to do, Diana, when I handled media and communications for a public health organization here in the province, is I tracked the issues that might attract attention. And so one day I always sign up for different Google alerts for different topics to see what's being said and how they're writing about it, or how it's being covered, or what are the kinds of things that people are latching onto. and came across my email that there was a report from out west in Canada of a type of vaccine that they were experiencing some shortages with, and it was a vaccine that's used often in the schedule for children aged 1 to 5. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'll go and talk with the medical officer of health. And so I went and I said, hey, this came across my desk. Are we having any issues? And he said, where'd you hear that? And I said, well, it was a reliable report from CBC up in western part of Canada. And he said, as a matter of fact, we just got an update about the shipment of vaccines and how it's going to be rolled out because of the supply chain issue. So I said, oh, well, very good. You're on top of it. No worries. Anyway, 2 hours later, I get a call from a local reporter who does this exact same thing, but from a different perspective as a journalist, to call me up and say, hey, Martha, I read this story on our sister website. Are we having any issues here in this province? So there are ways that you can use, and this is one of the things that I think is positive about search engines and subscribing to updates, is that it can do the work for you of trolling a number of sources so that you can then take time to evaluate and say, okay, I regularly want to receive information from this person because I reviewed their content and they're a reliable source. And so there are tools that we can use. And as Diana said, one of the things I would always do is also get to know the people in your neighborhood, and sometimes move out of the neighborhood and sometimes new people move in. So you have to cultivate those relationships and see what their understanding is. And I've never had an issue cultivating a particular reporter with an aspect of a story, because different reporters are intrigued, attracted, drawn into a story for different reasons. And so being able to provide multiple angles that might serve my multiple journalistic audiences was always a helpful approach, because people like something that's different. They don't want to be sharing the same information as their competitor. And it's an advantage for you, and it's also a plus for them.
Martha, you raised such a great point about that reporter who called you. He called you because he trusted you, and also because you already had a trusted relationship.
Yeah.
But also, if you hadn't heard that, that could have been the first information you had received about this, and you could have gone to your boss, who may not have heard about it as well, and become the bearer of this information that came from someone who's connected with the issues and contacted you as a reporter because he or she trusted you.
Shel, I wanted to just quickly come back to your initial question around, where do we as communication professionals focus our time in this new landscape with a lot of independent and perhaps more singularly focused journalists? Do you nurture the relationship with someone in their Substack audience, or do you look to more mass market media choices? And like everything we do, I would say that needs to be audience driven. So it's about finding where our audiences are for our particular message, in your case, construction. I used to do a lot of work in healthcare media relations, and nurtured some long-term relationships with reporters who were looking for very specific health research stories that over a period of time, they would learn to come to me and say, okay, it's heart month, what have you got? Or I would have come to them, kind of thing. But it is building the trust, and also from an organizational perspective, knowing what the best channel to my audience is.
Yeah, as some of you may know, that I am a podcaster and have been for a long, long time. And I probably get 6 or 7 pitches a day for guests to appear on my podcast. Generally, they're at least somewhat on topic, sometimes completely off topic. Every now and then we'll actually respond to one. It looks good. I would say probably 1 out of 50 we'll respond to. Are you pitching podcasts? Have you heard of other communicators doing it? Because I'm doing it now. I'm trying to get our subject matter experts and our thought leaders onto the appropriate podcast. One of the markets that we're active in is aviation. We do a lot of work at airports. building terminals and things like that. And we want to have the people who understand what it's like to be doing construction airside with the security and the safety issues there. We want to get them in front of the people who are making the decisions about who are we going to invite to bid on this project. And trying to find the aviation podcasts that they might listen to is a bit of a challenge. AI has been helpful, but I'm out there actively pitching podcasts. Is that something you're hearing about?
I've been building some media lists, and I've actually been trying to find some podcasts as well, some very specific podcasts. It is on my radar because, some of the podcasts may be small, but they are the target audience that I'm trying to reach very specifically. So again, I think when you're doing the job of media relations that we want to do, you're trying to get to your audience, right? And I think podcasts are one very specific way to do that. And I think, getting to, I was looking at the Cision State of the Media report that was done this year. And it's interesting the point that you just made, Shel, about whether or not the pitches that you're getting are the right pitches. And in the report, it said most journalists say that less than 25% of the pitches that they're getting are actually relevant to them. And so that's really key. Right. So, and not that has changed, because I think that is what most journalists have said for many, many, many years. I think that's one of their pet peeves. And so we always have to keep that in mind. And I just wanted also to point out that in the same survey, that 84% of the journalists actually said that they wanted media communicators to reach out to them via an email and introduce themselves before they ever pitch them, and start a relationship with them ahead of time before they actually ever started pitching them. And to start that relationship, introduce themselves, and to put some context around why they may be reaching out to them. And so it's all part of that relationship building ahead of time. So identifying who you could be reaching out to, and if that's that podcast is the right source for you to be connecting with the end audience, then that's the right way to go.
As a writer, I write for a lot of trade and professional journals, and if you have a relationship with an editor, that they know that you're going to write something and send it in that's going to be pretty good and pretty close to on time, then they don't say, what is it? Just send it along. I got a space for it. But if you don't know that editor, it's very hard to crack the nut. You really have to send all kinds of clips and examples of things that you've done, and answer a lot of questions about what you're going to write. So getting that relationship, once you're there, it makes all the difference in the world.
I think that's the absolute key to having a successful media relations component to your communications practice. It's connecting with the people and understanding what their needs are. They get hundreds of emails, and lots of them get funneled into the spam folder. They don't have time to read a pitch from someone who's just sent out 1,000 emails hoping something will stick or catch somebody's eye. And
pray.
Respecting their time is critical, and also understanding how they want to receive information. I once got a comment from a journalist who said, I can't actually do anything with your news release. And I said, oh dear, what did I do wrong? And he said, no, this is exactly how I would write it as a story, but I can't just run it 100% as is. And I was thinking, well, okay, that's pretty cool. I haven't lost my journalism training, because I did go on to do a journalism degree after my undergrad. But being able to present the information in the way that they can use. And so I do a lot of work supporting people who want to write op-ed pieces. And space is a consideration, and word count is a consideration, and being tight and concise and focused is huge. And sometimes people call me up and they've got 1,500 to 2,000 words. And I said, guys, no one's going to publish that. Right? Even though there is a market for long form journalism, and there's been some really incredible work done. But when it comes to an editorial piece or a commentary, you need to be really tight. And so being able to work with people who know that the stuff I'm going to send them is going to meet their specifications is already a step ahead in being able to achieve that coverage. Because then if it attracts the attention of the op editor, then they can move into, oh, well, maybe we should pursue this in the news section. And sometimes I've done that, and I've pitched that and say, hey, this person has written this piece, it's being published on Wednesday, but there are other nuances or aspects to the story that you might want to consider as a separate standalone news piece. So being able to cultivate those relationships, to have the trust, but also to respect their time and what their needs are is super important.
Just to go back to the podcast thing, Shel, for a second, I will say that at least in my observation of the next generation of business leaders, communication professionals, and our audience, frankly, in other words, the students I'm seeing in the classroom, when I ask them about channels, how would you get, if you were imagine you were working for an organization, how would you get your message out? I would say podcasting would be, the vast majority of them would be in their top 2 or 3, if not their number 1, in part because they have a more intimate relationship with podcasts and podcasters than perhaps previous generations have had. And so, in fact, there's this new form of connection and trust that is built between listeners and audiences and podcasters that I think needs to be taken into account in the ways that we show up as communication professionals.
I'd like to add to that, Jennifer. We are Luddites, right? If you've been around long enough to be considered to be a fellow, you're entrenched in the old ways. Except for Shel, he's always. So I sat next to this young lady on a plane. She was an influencer. She had millions of followers on Instagram and Facebook. And I'm watching her, and she's going like crazy with her thumbs. And I said, how do you do that? She said, what do you mean? I said, you go so fast with your thumbs. And she goes, well, how else do you do it? And I said, like this. And she gives me the okay, boomer look,
Right. Yeah. The other thing to think about with podcasts is that they do end up getting quoted now in the mainstream media. It's sort of the new man on the street. You end up seeing so-and-so said on a podcast. In fact, I've started listening to some podcasts because they get referenced. Oh, you need to listen to this interview with this guy on this podcast, said Paul Raitzer on his podcast. Right. So I think there's a way to get amplified if you're on a podcast. I do want to share a couple of the comments that we got, starting with Mirko Petricevic, who says, basically kudos to me for my little local online initiative. He does say that it doesn't fill the gap of critical reporting, and it absolutely does not. It's just finding facts and publishing them. What practices can comms pros adopt to support local reporting? And I'll turn that over to all of you in a sec, but I do want to direct people to Alabama News Center at alabamanewscenter.com. It was started by Alabama Power because they saw a vacuum in local reporting where they could get their own stuff out. So you'll see a lot of Alabama Power coverage in here, but you'll see coverage of other things: business, community, innovation, food and drink, and weather are the categories they have. There's no politics addressed here, but if there's a parade, I'm looking at a story here that Run for the Wall motorcyclists stopped in Tuscaloosa, Alabama to honor veterans. Those types of stories. So this is one model. Is if you've lost the local media outlet that you relied on to get information to your stakeholders, start your own.
All news is local, and if you can find a way to find someone in your organization who's achieving something, accomplished something, has an interesting story to tell, that localizes your main messages and gets you some opportunities in more local media. In an earlier lifetime in the Navy, I was responsible for the Fleet Hometown News Center, and we sent 1.13 million individualized press releases a year to local media, to radio, local newspapers, college alumni associations about the accomplishments of someone localized, or someone who went to that school, who lived in that town. These are their parents, and this is the accomplishment. They won an award. They graduated from a special course, and this was local news. And the vast majority of our newspapers, our editors, used it because it was local, and people will look for something that they can connect with locally.
The problem becomes now that the end source to be able to put that into something is now gone, right? So,
yes,
right, because I know exactly what you're talking about. And now those papers or those places are no longer existing. So where do you send something like that, right? And they're just not there. They're just not there anymore. It's funny because Martha was just talking about news releases that, they can't run them anymore. Now, I actually wrote a news release for becoming a fellow. And I actually sent it to the local online newspaper, and they actually ran it word for word. So you gotta love it, right? You love it when they actually run the news release you wrote word for word. And they actually ran it in the online local newspaper that I had become a fellow. And so it is that same kind of local story. And they, so them doing something like that, but there's a lot of places that just don't have the capacity to actually be able to do that anymore. I have seen a number of, as a judge for the Gold Quills or an evaluator, I have seen a number of submissions come through where corporations or companies are actually including in their corporate newsletters, places where they're talking about what is going on in their local cities. And so there are companies that are taking up that gauntlet and including information about what is going on within their company newsletters. So that's always nice to see, doing something like that.
It's a good way to humanize your organization.
Yeah, people like to be seen. People like to be recognized, and organizations that have departments or divisions or teams in different parts of the country or their provinces or states do well to include those perspectives rather than always seeing it come from head office. It's a challenge in Canada where a lot of the media outlets in terms of national coverage are concentrated in central Canada. It means that the local voice gets lost, and it's a bigger challenge if you want to really get some national coverage. And I work with a company in Ottawa, and one of the things that we have found is that what media wants is something that will connect the issue to the people in the area that they are servicing, in terms of news, however it is, in terms of the web or an actual publication, a radio, broadcast, or a podcast. And sometimes you're finding crossover where some former newspaper outlets are now including video coverage in their stories so that they can show the progress of a news conference. So being adaptable and responsive, I think, is challenging when that funneling thing is happening with centralization of news sources. But if you can connect people to other people in their different regions, then it, from an internal communications perspective, it really does build solidarity and humanizes, as Ned said, the workplace, because people see that their employer recognizes that unique aspect of them in terms of if you're in the South or the North or the West or wherever.
Let me get this last comment in from Brian Kilgore. And this is fascinating, and I don't disagree with this at all. This is looking at this from the other angle. Sources at the decision-making level won't talk to reporters or appear on camera, and instead only issue statements. I remember a few years ago, I read a piece, I think it might have been in the Columbia Journalism Review or the Neiman Labs, or one of the journalism reporting outlets, that said that the Washington Post had approached a big company, I think it was Clorox, about participating in a report that they were doing. And the response from Clorox was, no thanks, we don't need you, to the Washington Post. If coverage is important, how do we convince our leadership that we need to be doing this, even as we see the erosion of the media landscape?
Well, I think it's funny. I had coffee with a journalist friend yesterday morning, and she was talking about an article she was working on for The Economist. So, pretty high profile piece. And she approached a federal cabinet minister whose purview it is to who is a subject matter expert, and his office said, we'll provide a statement. And she said, this is The Economist. I think an interview is warranted. To which they agreed, but it sort of took that a reminder. But something related to this, Shel, that I wanted to mention is this kind of dissemination of responsibility for sharing the news, which we've been talking about in a variety of ways, that comes to us as organizational communicators. But it also takes into account the new look of the media landscape. The same journalist friend runs a major journalism program here in British Columbia. It's a recognized program across Canada, and they've stopped intake of their journalism program and are reevaluating its role, its relevance, its purpose, etc. However, one of the really interesting things she's been talking to us about is the distribution, the desire to ensure that the distribution of those skills continues at the school. So in other words, they still want to ensure that students have good writing skills, critical thinking skills, all of those things. So where this comes back to your question about the executive level presence is the reminder that we are, like with many roles, we're wearing many hats, and executives need to see themselves that way, need to see themselves as part of not just a contributor to or an observer of or a bystander of the news cycle, but an actual participant in the news cycle, which we as communication professionals are in a new way as well. We're partners with journalists. Many journalists are working in communications. And so I think we can bring a refreshed understanding of the way that landscape works in a way that means we build trust and community within each other to get those important messages out.
No other thoughts on Brian's point?
Well, I think we're seeing more of it. Sometimes it's because people have less time and it's easier. They feel that way they can control the message because it's the statement, so the statement gets quoted. And I think it's interesting what Jennifer said, because there is still a lot of fear in terms of how you might get treated by the media and how your words may get used. And so I think people see it as the easy way out to say, okay, we have a statement, they have a photo of the person who's speaking, they can run with that. And so I work with media relations coaching and performance presentation, and getting people over that fear is one of the things that comes up every single time.
And I had to throw up on the screen a comment that we got from Diane Chase saying, yes, Jennifer. So,
thanks, Diane.
We are about out of time, less than 90 seconds left. So I do want to let everybody know what's coming up in August on Circle of Fellows. Episode number 132 will take place at 6 p.m. East Coast time. The time shifts based on who's on the panel, and this time on the panel, we have Adrian Cropley from Australia. So the time has shifted to accommodate his participation. I still think it's going to be a very early hour for Adrian, but we will be talking about artificial intelligence issues in communication, notably pivotal points for the profession. And I'm not going to guess what we're going to be talking about in a month, because the whole landscape could change again in 30 days. I mean, you look at the news just recently, and it's all about open weight models from China. reading Chris Penn saying, you can't block them because they're the only ones that people can use to develop their own models, even if it's a U.S. Research company. So, I mean, all kinds of interesting things that we can talk about. That panel, in addition to Adrian, will include Bonnie Caver, Thea Mary Karamanis, and Mike Klein. So it should be a great panel. And to Diana, Martha, Jennifer, and Ned, thank you so much for your participation today. I think this has been a great discussion. I think a sign of what a really good conversation does. I didn't get off question 1 on my list of questions. It just kind of snowballed from there, and we had a great conversation. So until next month, see you all later, everyone.
Thanks, Shel. Bye,
Always
guys.
a pleasure.